or any indicator, this topic is both fresh and relevant. I'm therefore excited to welcome our panel on why crypto needs the law, and our moderator, Nisa M. Oyles, the managing partner at A100X Ventures. Please welcome our speakers.
Watch out for water bottles that get left on prior panels. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Hope you're having a good time here. I want to welcome out the panel, Sandra Rowe, Chris Perkins, Ashley Scott, and Kevin Warbeck. So the name of this panel is Why Does Crypto Need the Law? And we heard Lewis Cohen and Hester Pierce this morning talking about very timely SEC crackdown. And so we don't want to focus too much on the SEC because there is so much more to talk about. So I'm going to start to ask the panel to just introduce themselves. And we'll start with you, Ashley.
Okay, here we go. Hi, my name is Ashley Scott. I'm the Senior Director of Global Policy at Circle. Circle, we are an internet-native financial infrastructure company, but we are most known for issuing USD coin, which is an electronic money token, or some people call it a payment stable coin. But really what I'd like to say in the most simplest form is that it is a digital form of the dollar. And we use the power of both USDC and the number of payment infrastructure APIs and other with blockchain technology to help merchants, cross-border remittances, payments and settlements, and really evolve financial infrastructure using the power of blockchain technology.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Sandra Rowe. I'm the CEO of the Global Blockchain Business Council, also known as the GBBC. We're now the world's largest blockchain and digital assets group of its kind. We've got more than 500 institutional members across over 100 jurisdictions and 231 ambassadors at last count. We focus on everything from digital identity to crypto to digital assets, tokenization, cybersecurity, quantum-resistant blockchains, you name it, we probably have a vertical or some type of work that we're doing in this space.
My name is Chris Perkins. I'm the president of Coin Fund. We're one of the oldest, started in 2015, crypto-native asset management companies. We have pre-seed and seed, along with venture strategies. We also have a liquid strategy. I also happen to be on the CFTC's Global Markets Advisory Committee, so we can also talk about some of the things the CFTC are doing, and I'll be presenting there in DC on Monday.
Kevin Warbeck, Chair of the Legal Studies and Business Ethics Department at the Wharton School here at Penn, and Director of the Wharton Blockchain and Digital Asset Project, which does work, a significant amount of work around legal policy and regulatory issues for blockchain and Web3.
Great, thank you. So why don't we kick off just talking about what kind of legislation we can expect to see this year, if at all. And kind of the mood, I know, Sandra, you're in DC now, and Chris, you're going to DC and you're part of that group. So, what are you hearing from Congress? Is there a need to legislate in areas that are not sufficiently covered right now? And, what can we expect to see?
Why don't I kick off? I sat through the 4-hour Financial Services Subcommittee hearing with the current FTX CEO, John Ray III. They were very deferential to Mr. Ray, but I will tell you, the anger was palpable in the room. And my colleague who's also here, Summer Singh, can attest to that. DC is pissed off in the biggest way that, I actually found that quite surprising by the level of animosity and, frankly, disgust there is around the fraud that's occurred. But I do think here's a couple things. Number one, and I'm going to flip it to the positive. Education is needed across the board, and I'm talking at every agency level and including on the Hill, around not only the tokenization opportunity set, what's actually real, that's creating value for people, and the use cases that matter, as well as widening the opportunity discussion around why, for example, a stablecoin, a US dollar equivalent in the digital space, is actually going to be very important to have that discourse. And so I think we need to change the narrative by talking about education-based and real use case-based, real value-based examples.
Chris.
Thanks. I think that's a good answer. And I do feel that there's a lot of animosity right now because I don't think a lot of people understood that FTX is not crypto, right? So we do have a ton of education to do. But my thesis from the very beginning is that we desperately need new principles-based legislation from elected officials. If you look at our current law, and a lot of people don't know this, everything in the world is a commodity except onions, movie receipts, and securities. That's how it works. Securities are subject to the Howey test, and they say, okay, it meets these provisions. Those are securities. The challenge that I've seen to date is that you have two different regulators, and by the way, I don't think a third regulator makes a ton of sense. They try to figure out which of these buckets it should go into. What I'm hopeful for is that we step back and we actually empower our regulators, because good regulation is a good thing. And we are seeing, regulators pop up along the world. I think in time you're going to see actually jurisdictions compete for more thoughtful regulation. But gosh, wouldn't it be great to go on the offense and create a principles-based legislation that empowers regulators to enforce various principles? And which of those principles be? Client protections. They should be things such as disclosures. But it should be driven from new policy, because I'm sorry, I don't think when the Howey test was put forth, and by the way, regulators will disagree with me on this, and it should be a discussion that we should have, but I don't think they understood what a DAO was going to be, or how DeFi could actually, and if you step back, look at something like DeFi, right? More inclusive finance. It provides better access to the system. And yes, maybe there should be some thoughts around how to protect people from nefarious actors, but it's transparent, right? And so how do we work with the legislature to come out with principles-based and really to empower regulators to do what they have to do? Right now it's been challenging because I don't think the regulators are, they're not backed by law in many cases. It's gray and it's hard, and I just wish we could take a different approach.
Kevin.
So the good news is over the last year, we've had serious, thoughtful, bipartisan legislation developed and introduced. The Lummis-Gillibrand bill, the Stabenow-Bozeman bill, the Waters-McHenry bill. The bad news is almost none of it is likely to pass anytime soon. The possible exception of some stablecoin legislation. Partly because, what Sandra talked about, that just in the current climate, there's a lot more skepticism and a lot more concern about the digital asset space, and partly because fundamentally we've got just such a political divide in this country. Even though these are now bipartisan bills, it takes a tremendous amount of political capital to get anything through this Congress. And of all the things that the U.S. Congress could possibly do, I hate to break it to you in this room, crypto legislation is probably not at the very, very top. It's unlikely anything's going to happen, but the industry has really changed over the course of the last 2 years, due in part by work by some of the organizations that are here and elsewhere at the conference, really coming in, engaging, educating policymakers, and going beyond the view of this is new technology, we should just have Congress stay out of it, to saying we actually need legislation for clarity. So we're moving in the right direction. I think there's a fair degree of consensus about the broad principles about what legislation would look like, both for exchanges and token issuance and for stable coins. The likelihood, though, is, to your question, is it's very unlikely that in the next year or so we're actually going to have that happen.
But stablecoins, right? That might happen. So tell us about, from your point of view, what you're seeing there.
Yeah, we are really excited. I think Chairman McHenry has been very vocal about thinking that stablecoins, or payment stablecoins as they've termed it, is the right first step, or the first bite at the apple in trying to regulate the space. And it makes sense, right? I think from a legislative perspective, people on the Hill are looking for utility value outside of the digital ecosystem. I know all of us here really get excited about what happens in the Web3 space and the digital ecosystem, but I think what legislators are really looking for are case study issues of, outside of buying an NFT, what can I do with a payment stablecoin? And I think on our side, it's really taking a step back and not taking an adversarial approach to the Hill, but actually working together to create case studies and examples of that. I think it's not just Chairman McHenry, but even great work from Senator Lummis, Senator Gillibrand, and there are a number of different legislators who have publicly said that although the fallout, we have to address the elephant in the room. What happened with FTX did have a huge implosion on the Hill. I think what's at the core of it are two things for those who've been generally supportive is, one, they believe in blockchain technology for financial innovation, but two, we as an industry have to come to the table and get serious about consumer protection and realize that that is a real thing and come with ideas of what it means to allow financial innovation and have that intersection of consumer protection. So that's what we've been trying to do.
Can I ask a question? Totally agree with you on the utility, and I think stablecoins are like the perfect example of that utility. You know, when I was working at a bank, the Herstat risk, the settlement risk we ran was in billions of dollars, and you can eliminate it overnight, right? Totally agree with that. Do you think that, totally hearing the same thing out of McHenry, but do you think that we'll be able to get stablecoin legislation out of the Senate? I understand that that's been more problematic, and like we were hearing that it was potentially going to happen. Now I'm hearing, well, maybe not so fast, and we'd just love to know the latest.
Yeah, I mean, personhood is our biggest thing, and we've been trying to find champions. I think we have to acknowledge that Sam Bankman-Fried was very, very active and present on the Hill, and now we have to build credibility again as a company. I think as Circle, we've done a large part of that, and really we are in the throes in building those strong relationships, particularly on the Democratic side, to make sure that we can show that let's not legislate through enforcement, right? What we constantly tell legislators is that regulation by enforcement assumes harm. It usually comes after there's been a large harmful event, while legislation smokes out bad actors and creates rules of the road in which companies that are responsible can rise to the occasion, and those will be very evident fairly soon.
So consumer protection is certainly very important and talked about a lot, but so is systemic risk. And so what we've seen this week alone with what they're calling like Operation Choke Point 2.0 or Python politics, whatever you want to call it, cutting off crypto via the banking system. What's your opinion on what's happening? And we'll start with Kevin.
Well, I think that's the leading edge, the point of the spear when you talk about the reaction to FTX. And it wasn't just FTX, there's Celsius and BlockFi and Terra Luna before that and so forth. So I think that's the area where you've seen the biggest shift, that under the Biden administration, the banking regulators, I think, were a lot more open to the potential of crypto earlier on. And then, about a month or so ago, there was a joint letter by the Federal Reserve, the comptroller of the currency, and the FDIC, the major banking regulators, basically saying we are extremely skeptical that a digital asset-based entity can appropriately meet the safety and soundness requirements for banking. And then shortly thereafter, they denied a request for a Federal Reserve master account to Custodia, which is a Wyoming chartered special purpose crypto bank using a special set of rules that were designed in Wyoming to have a good regulatory framework for meeting those kinds of requirements. So I think the big question is going to be, what does an appropriate risk management framework and set of practices look like for a bank that wants to not just custody, hold someone else's digital assets, but actually have digital assets on its balance sheet and interact with the crypto industry. I certainly agree that the sort of scare tactics about crypto is inherently evil are problematic. But I think there's still some real issues about articulating what does it mean to provide the level of assurance that we expect for banks. And we take for granted appropriately that our banking system is not going to blow up. That's a really good thing. That doesn't happen very often. And so I think the conversation needs to evolve further on exactly, similar to what we've talked about, you heard this morning about in securities, what's the path to compliance? I think that's also the piece that's going to be necessary in this area.
Can I just add one piece, because we're kind of zoned in on Washington, D.C., and don't get me wrong, the U.S. is incredibly important. But when we look at the global map, we've got the European Union that have come up with a framework, whether you call it MICA or MiCA, it doesn't matter. It's still 500 million people, 26 countries that you'll be able to passport as an entrepreneur. That is 500 million consumers, your audience, potentially of clients on day one. How amazing is that? And if that framework, as it's going through the system, gets implemented, it is a real competitor to anything else the US may or may not come up with. And then let's go to Singapore. They've already attracted a huge amount of talent and businesses in that region. Asia has a very different view about a lot of this. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely regulation coming into place in different pockets. But even the Japanese have actually turned a little bit more favorable on the kind of frameworks they're putting together for crypto exchanges. So what all I'm trying to say is the global landscape is incredibly important, and what's going on in the US is different than what's going on in the rest of the world.
I spoke to the new CEO of Vara yesterday. So the UAE is incredibly aggressive in saying, and by the way, I don't think anyone on stage is saying we don't think regulations are a good thing. They are. And what we need is that clarity so that our entrepreneurs can build. They're probably not going to get it perfect, but even with some clarity, they can find out what to do. And one other thing that we're seeing is this shift away from public blockchains. There seems to be this thinking that, well, we kind of like the technology, but it has to be private, which kind of defeats the purpose of what we're trying to build and some of the principles that are able to be achieved through blockchain. Going back to the statement of the 27th, I was frustrated because it said, we don't trust public blockchains, but we want to come up with a system that's more inclusive, more efficient, cheaper. Uniswap publishes an article that says you can save 80% of your remittances through blockchain technology. So I feel like back to the big basics, education is more important than ever now. And we just need to really invest as an industry in it.
So back to the international points, what is it, other than what people say we're just going to drive the innovation overseas, right? What points have you seen in that are pushing the U.S.'s button? Is it the dominance of the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency? Is it what is it going to take for them to realize that they need to act in line with the other countries?
I would definitely say the US dollar in a digital world, we really do need to figure out. And the first step in is a stable coin that is backed one for one with dollar. And when you say that to folks on not only just the Hill, but in different agencies, that actually does get people's attention because the US dollar reserve status is not to be taken for granted. And what the US can do because of its reserve status does not necessarily translate into a digital world of the future, and people realize that.
I agree with Sandra. I think what really drives is the electronic money space race. And I think you've seen even the last hearing by House Financial Services last week on US competitiveness with China. And there were a number of different questions that spoke to the digital yuan. I think US legislators really understand that we do have to do something to make the dollar competitive in the US space. You have the EU that is looking into creating the digital euro. So generally, the global financial system is recognizing that digitizing money is the way to go. I mean, even in general conversation, when you're at dinner with a friend, you don't say, okay, I'm going to pull out my $5 and we'll split the bill. We say, I'll Venmo you, right? So understanding that that is the culture that we're creating, it just makes sense that the logical first step is creating tokenized cash.
We have an incredible opportunity.
Venmo's only in the U.S., so.
Correct.
So that
Well, that's
makes
what we're trying
sense
to
with developing
address.
countries or.
Exactly.
We have an incredible opportunity, not only to perpetuate the US dollar as a reserve currency, but probably even to make it more dominant. And there may be some backlash because of that. But think about it. If you're in a developing world, would you rather have Bitcoin or would you rather have dollars? Probably dollars, because there's more utility, less volatility, right? So I think there's incredible opportunity to extend it. Now, the way that this should play out is that a stable coin needs to be in keeping with our principles and values. The Chinese understand. They've created a digital yuan with a centralized wallet, very much in keeping with their central ideologies. Our dollars, our digital dollars, need to be private. And it's very important that as we embrace the technology, we educate that that's an important part, because why? It'll create even more adoption. And I think there are ways to balance national security. In fact, I come from a national security background. I think stable coins are actually a national security opportunity for the United States as well.
Yeah, it is important to realize, though, that we are still pretty early. And if you look at all of the metrics about where is the financial activity around digital assets, it's still very much dominated by speculative trading. Now, where's the development activity? Where is the investment? Where is the innovation? Where are people building in Web3? Tremendous amount happening. I don't need to if I said anything else in a room like this, people would probably come up and drag me off stage. I completely agree with that. But if you look at what are people actually putting money into, still primarily the kinds of trading activity, which is fine, but that raises a whole separate set of issues. And even stable coins are, become used as an enabler for trading and for DeFi. We need to move towards this next stage where we can look and point to at scale use cases, not just use cases that exist, but real significant case studies of something else. And that's an evolution that's happening. Again, lots of things are out there at various kinds of stages. That's, I think, potentially what will change the debate. The discussion that we've been having about stable coins and central bank digital currencies, yes, no question. The China threat is a big concern in the U.S. But concern about the ECNY digital yuan in China is not necessarily going to lead to figuring out something around the Howey test in the U.S. for issuing tokens. The other thing to keep in mind is, yes, they have comprehensive frameworks in other places, but there's still not a Coinbase in Europe. There's still not a Circle in Europe. The biggest share of activity and development and the major platforms are still here. That's not guaranteed to be the case forever. I totally agree with that. But it's really easy to say the center of gravity is going to move. It takes some time for that to occur.
Can I just give an example? I was in Cape Town, South Africa, with a bunch of central bankers from sub-Saharan Africa, regulators. And what is one of the top topics they were talking about besides funding and the usual stuff that central bankers talk about? Well, they're talking about how all their young population are adopting crypto and what they're going to do about either their own CBDC version or a block CBDC for East Africa, for example, or West Africa. This is top of book for a lot of folks because primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, if you look at the demographics, it's incredibly young. They are the ones who have phones, know how to use them, and will use them quite well. And mobile payments, not a problem. And so what I call the velocity of adoption is actually going to, I think, surprise people because it won't be a linear jump, it'll be literally an exponential jump. And when we see that, I think people, this is why we're having these conversations now. Because if it already happens, it's too late. And we need to figure out what the macro trends are. And I think the macro trends are actually coming from developing nations.
Absolutely. So just switching gears a little bit, this week we saw a case, Hermes Birkin against Meta Birkin. And there's this whole other area of the law, like copyright, trademark. How do we regulate the metaverse, right? And this is I understand, far down on the priorities of emergencies that are going on in the blockchain space, but I still think it's worth talking about now. And there are certainly plenty of companies in that sector that are, trying to talk to Congress, et cetera, to figure out, how do they operate? How do they be compliant? So, Kevin, why don't you give us some thoughts on, regulating the metaverse?
So it's a big topic. We have a Wharton Executive Education online program called Business in the Metaverse Economy, which covers this among other things. Well, I guess what I would say more generally, I think your point is a good one. We often, when we're talking about law and blockchain, crypto, Web3, immediately jump to the regulatory issues, which is one set of issues, but there are a spectrum of other legal issues. You mentioned some of the intellectual property questions, there are contract law questions, there are corporate law questions. My group did a collaboration with the World Economic Forum, released a paper last month in Davos on DAOs, which had a bunch of things in it, but one piece of it was looking at the question about what are the appropriate corporate law forms for DAOs. Has implications for regulation, has implications for taxation, but corporate law is its own domain of law, which varies by country, and even with the US varies by state. So I think most of these questions, like the metaverse ones that you described, are the kinds of questions that get resolved in litigation. It's not that we fundamentally change the nature of copyright law. That happens very seldom. Because these laws are pretty broad in general. In a country like the US, which is a common law country, you have something where someone comes up and says, oh, I'm going to make this bag and say it's an art project, even though it's a knockoff of a very valuable trademark of a luxury brand company. And the courts do what I think most legal experts thought the courts were going to do and said, no. It's not an art project. You're just like someone else who is effectively infringing the trademark. There are hard cases, there are gray areas, but I think through the accumulation of more of that, we'll get more clarity there what the law is. But no, I mean, the metaverse question is a good one, it's an important one. We're also still really early in that space. What exactly these metaverse spaces are, what are the business models, what role do digital assets play in them? As those things develop and there's more adoption, we're going to run into those legal problems, but as someone who's got a lot of gray hair because I've been doing emerging tech for 25 years, we had all these questions when the internet came up. They were hard questions, there were right answers and wrong answers, but I think as in this case, we'll eventually muddle through.
So NFTs are the most successful consumer technology since the mobile phone. $50 billion in sales in the last 2 years. So I think it's an incredibly exciting vertical. We start with this concept of creator economy, JPEGs, whatever, but you can take anything, and essentially what Web3 allows you to do is put private property into the internet. So it's an incredibly exciting vertical. Hopefully that it delivers incremental utility as we have this identity on the internet, and I'm pretty excited about it.
So Chris, why don't we talk a little bit about the CFTC, because you're part of this committee. We know that there's been kind of, whose domain is it? SEC, CFTC. We know that in the FTX case, the ledger was, regulated under CFTC. They hold that out as successful, in a disaster, right? So what do you intend to do on this committee? What do you intend to get out of it? What are you seeing, hearing?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I talked about the differences in jurisdiction between the CFTC and SEC. My thesis is it really doesn't matter, right? What matters is the principles. And I don't want to see an instance where you're jamming legacy regulation into an existing jurisdiction. If you step back and you look at how today's regulation is structured, it's predicated upon intermediaries. Why? Because we didn't have technology back in the day, and so we needed these central nodes that we could regulate. Now, blockchain technology allows you to eliminate that node. I testified in front of Congress on this. And so rather than be prescriptive and say, for derivatives in the United States, you need to have a DCM, an FCM, a DCO, and an FCM. These are all licenses that you need. Well, no, I actually don't need them. I can deliver client protections through smart contracts. I don't need an intermediary anymore because it's much more efficient without one. I can settle in real time rather than 24-hour or 48-hour batches. And so my goal is to educate and explain, hey, we can solve for these same principles. Let's amend the regulation, but we're going to get to the same place because customer protections, disclosures matter.
You know, something else, and I'm sure you came across this as you had conversations about the DCCPA, is understanding what to do with DeFi. And I think it's homework that's both on the industry and on the Hill, right? In having conversations with legislators, I say there are 3 buckets, right? There are things that are purely DeFi, that's easy to identify, things that tout themselves as DeFi, but really are centralized, and the gray. And that's where we need to figure out where to draw the line with the gray. And, you know, I think there was a lot of concern last year with legislation, but I think what was disheartening was it was an opportunity to have a conversation about the ecosystem and understanding that definitions need to be had. I think if I had anything to impart to the greater digital asset community is that people want to define things as much as we do not want things to be defined. And so I do think we need to continue digging deep and trying to figure out what is that real line, because we don't want to curb all this excellent innovation that's happened in the DeFi space, but really understanding that from a legislative perspective, it's, well, where do we draw this line of consumer protection?
Yeah, we're going to be probably talking about the UkiDAO case, which is really fascinating. If you don't know about it, a couple of folks did something they weren't supposed to do, and then they said, well, we're just going to call it a DAO and we'll be fine. And the CFTC, I'm totally oversimplifying, said, well, wait a second, no, if you voted in that DAO, you're in big trouble. And anyone who voted in that DAO is in big trouble. Now, do I think the people who said that we're creating this DAO did the right thing? Absolutely not. But was the CFTC right to say if you voted, then you're in trouble? It's kind of contrary to this thing we call democracy, and we should be encouraging people to participate and to vote. And so that's the kind of nuance that needs to be applied. And in a world that lacks nuance, I totally agree. DeFi needs to be really thought about. That was one of the biggest critiques of the DCCPA, right? Just threw it in together. They're distinctly different. And frankly, CeFi needs to be regulated in a much more different way.
Yeah, and just to add to the point that you've rightfully distinguished, there is a whole category of activities that are pretty much mirror to what's going on in financial services. And I say this as a former derivatives banker, that there are a lot of things that are pretty much the same. They just happen to have a cryptocurrency version of it. And frankly, those rules should apply. The business functions are pretty much the same. However, in areas that we're talking about gray and pure DeFi, absolutely, there must be another level of conversation. And frankly, I don't even think there's enough education around the right folks who can legislate, who know enough about this to even have that conversation yet. But the point being is, I think we are talking about 2 levels of legislation right now. One is stuff that exists, and then the second is the TBD, much harder level.
Yeah, two quick things. On DeFi, I completely agree, and I think there's a real need for those of you who are builders or who are in the industry to think about what solutions and responses there are to the legitimate kinds of concerns that policymakers and regulators might have about DeFi. I'm not saying focus on specific rules and whether they're good or bad, but there is a question about investor protection. How do people who are participating get the information they need? There's a set of questions around illicit finance, money laundering, sanctions evasion, terrorist financing, where there's a need to have some mechanism so it's not trivially easy to untraceably send money to child sex traffickers and terrorists. There's a set of issues around systemic risk. The programmability and composability of DeFi raise a real challenge about being able to accurately assess the level of risk in the system as a whole. Those are problems that the industry needs to grapple with on its own, but those are big categories of problems that Congress and regulators are worried about. And there's certainly a need for education, and organizations like Sandra's and others, and companies like Circle do a lot of good work on that with policymakers. But I think there's really going to be a need for a broader discussion about what are the tools and techniques that might, in many cases, address these issues better. There are certainly possibilities to use cryptographic techniques to have better mechanisms to do identity in a way that's non-centralized and so forth to address some of these illicit finance risks, for example. But I think that's something where the industry organizations play a role, but everyone in the industry, I think, needs to think about how they might have information and contribute to that. The other thing I'll say is about a year ago, Sandra and I actually testified before the Senate Agriculture Committee, which happens to be the committee that oversees the CFTC. And there was a kind of short, curly-haired guy on the panel with us who was Sam Banker Fraud or something like that. I don't remember. I don't know what happened to him, but he was one of the other witnesses on the panel with us. One of the challenges that we have in the U.S. system is there is this bifurcation between the securities regulator and the commodities regulator. Almost no other major jurisdiction still has something like that. Thinking about changing that, even though there's very good reasons to do that, that's even more inconceivable than any of the legislation that we're talking about. So that's the reality of our system. That also means that there are institutional groups advocating and associated with each of those communities. And those two organizations have different skill sets. And so we're going to have to navigate through this. It's nice to sort of think in the abstract, well, what if we just took a big paintbrush and changed the legal system in the U.S. for financial regulation? We've got what we got, and I think there are good people and smart people and people who are thoughtful in all of those areas who are trying to get to the right point, but there's still a long way to go.
So we know that any kind of regulation won't prevent fraud, but what about an SRO? Do we need an SRO in this country?
I mean, I can start. So SRO is a self-regulatory organization. So, for example, for broker-dealers in the securities industry, there's something called FINRA, which is a private industry group, but overseen very actively by the SEC. And they do a lot of the frontline work for brokers and for exchanges and so forth. So short answer, yes. I think there is a role, given the technical nature, the distinctive nature of the digital asset world. I think there would be a value as part of an overall regulatory structure, not as an alternative to other kinds of rules, of having some sort of public or public-private entity. I haven't yet seen a lot of great thinking about what that would look like. Yesha Yadav was at Vanderbilt, has a law review paper out about self-regulation by exchanges. But yeah, I think that's another area where I think it's absolutely worth exploring. But we need to have details. It can't just be, oh, there should be an SRO. We heard a lot of this during the ICO bubble in 2017. Let's just create some private organization that decides what's a security. And I think appropriately regulators say, no. You can't just do this in a half-assed way. It has to be really serious and thoughtful and show that it addresses the industry concerns and also addresses the policy concerns.
It's really, really hard to regulate away fraud, manipulation, and abuse. I was in traditional finance, and in the futures industry, we saw a company called Peregrine Financial. Maybe you remember. This guy faked bank statements for a really long time, and a lot of money was lost. And so the only way to defeat fraud of that nature is through something called transparency. And if only there was a technology that we could look at on-chain and deliver transparency, it'd be awesome. And so, these are the opportunity sets that we have, and we need to educate people on. We have new technology that can deliver client segregation that's better than ever, and that addresses this. So to me, that's always the answer is transparency.
Right, but the industry needs to actually do that, right? So people looked at FTX and said, oh, it's blockchain, it's transparent. Of course it wasn't.
Yeah.
So I think there needs to be education, but also the industry needs to really step up and do things in a transparent way.
We're seeing an entire new class of exchanges coming online saying, hey, look, it's on chain, and clearly you can go on and verify it yourself.
Yeah, the trading side needs to actually implement the technology that we're talking about here. But just one point, having worked at a TradFi SRO, these things take time. My answer to you right now is this industry not ready for an SRO in any capacity. I think the step one is what's happening at the moment, which are there are a number of public-private councils, whatever you want to call them, groups, GMACs, they're being formed all over the US government right now. Every agency I can think of is now either contemplating or has already set one up. It's just you'll never hear about it because most of them are private. But they've set up asking private sector experts, whether it's industry like Circle or associations or academia like asking Professor Warbach here, but getting people who actually have been in the space for a while, getting their input from the private sector side, and then translating that back to whatever agency name your alphabet soup of agencies. They're all trying to set up now groups like this. That is the first good step forward. And then beyond that, we'll hopefully see an SRO.
Great. So why don't we open it up for any questions that the audience has?
Don't be shy. There's got to be a question out there.
All right.
There's one there.
Oh. Oh, okay, go ahead.
I don't think we have mics, so maybe just stand up.
You may have to shout.
Yeah.
As far as the recent crack-in kind of regulatory by enforcement, I think you guys are calling it that. When we had the chairman of the SEC up there earlier, it almost, and I'm not, nothing directed to her personally, but the SEC as an organization, it almost seemed like they were playing for like willful ignorance, as in like, I'm not sure why it happened at this time or why this enforcement, but with the staking, it seems almost like, and I think you guys touched on it, the kind of chokehold or Python 2.0. Do you think that there is like very specific intent? Because I wouldn't assume that like Gary Gensler is putting these like arbitrary decisions. Like it seems very purposeful to go after like the utility behind staking. And we were kind of just like as we were discussing that, it seems like they're just trying to take the utility and any of the actual benefits out of crypto to make it so that people don't want to enter and we're only left with all the bad stuff. So I don't know what you guys have, any opinions or just kind of beliefs about kind of the intent and the purpose of these specific actions that they're taking. And you touched on Spooky DAO as well, and in that case it seems more going after a smaller player, but targeting kind of like a bad action, whereas now they've targeted a big actor. I personally would say it wasn't a bad action that they're doing, like it's not fraud, it's just trying to remove any the actual utility. So I don't know how you guys feel about like the intent and decisions they've made.
Anyone?
So I haven't read the full account yet, but I've read several interpretations of this. I think the issue we need to think about is concepts around consumer protection. So if you're pooling different tokens together and they're being staked and then you're offering a fixed yield, how does that work? What does that look like? Shouldn't you be segregating customer funds? And these are things that I think are going to come more and more to light. Are you doing KYC AML on the front end? And then on the back end, are you actually segregating customer funds? Are you dipping into that pool, mixing them all up, and using them for nefarious purposes? Or for even beneficial purposes, except you've not done good record keeping, right? And I think these are things where when things go wrong, when things go right, nobody cares because everyone's making money. But when things go wrong, who's accountable? And things have gone very, very wrong recently.
Let me just go. So I would invite any of the undergrads that are here, I would encourage you go to law school and take a class in law school that sounds incredibly boring. It's called administrative law. This will be the key to unlocking an understanding of how the government works. Because the vast majority of the legal activity that actually touches on the economy today is administrative regulation, more so than legislation. It's under the framework of legislation. So the SEC is an independent agency. It's got 5 commissioners, 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, because the Democrats are in the White House. Commissioner Peirce, who spoke here this morning, is one of the 5 commissioners, a Republican minority commissioner. They can all express their views. A decision by the commission as a whole, they have to take a vote on an actual rulemaking proceeding. Enforcement actions, like the one against Kraken, they're overseen by the commission, but they come up through the staff of the agency. And so certainly the chairman of the agency in particular has a lot of influence over what the enforcement priorities are, and the commission as a whole has some control over what gets decided. But most of the time when you see these enforcement actions, a lot of it has to do with this is a case that someone in enforcement has decided to bring, and they have the evidence. They think they can actually prove it and win, or they get a settlement and a consent decree with the parties. In this case, in the Kraken case, it's clear that this was not just random. That the SEC had made clear it had concerns about yield products. Coinbase was told, do not offer your earned product, they didn't offer it. BlockFi was sued by the SEC. And the staking decision was suggesting that this staking as a service, as Kraken was offering it, was effectively a different kind of a yield product, which has to be issued as a security. So in that case, yes, there was certainly an agenda there. But I don't think it's fundamentally about staking, and I think the fair criticism, which you heard somewhat, I think, from Commissioner Peirce, is, well, what's the guidance? How far does that extend? Should we be afraid that anyone doing native non-custodial staking, that's swept in by this? I think it's appropriate to criticize the agency for not providing that kind of guidance, but it's really easy, and I think usually wrong, to make judgments based on an action or two. And I see a lot of stuff on crypto Twitter about this is happening because this is what Gary Gensler, this is how he thinks he's going to be Treasury Secretary and things like that. And I would just urge you, most of the time, unless that's coming from someone who really is in the guts of what's going on in DC and knows all these people personally, just be very skeptical about those generalizations.
I've got a couple of observations. First, the White House put out a paper on, I think, on the 27th of January, emphasizing that they want to make sure that crypto and traditional banking stay separate. And so that it is what it is, and that's their vision. As you look into the regulatory agencies, and I think, I'm not a lawyer, didn't take the class, wish I did, but you stick around Wall Street long enough, you learn it. Rather than seeing guidance, I'd prefer rulemaking. And there are certain administrative procedures that a rulemaking must go through, specifically public comment period, right? And we've seen instances where people are trying to shrink that public comment period. It's a really important part of rulemaking. You say, hey, I got a rule. What do you think, public? And you're supposed to take into consideration that feedback. Second part of it that's really important, and we've been focusing on this for many years, is cost-benefit analysis. And we really need to focus on this. It's a requirement under the APA, I think, where before you put out a rule, you have to say, hey, here's the cost and here's the benefit. When we unpack that through what we're seeing with Web3 and blockchain technology, I think you put a lot of thought into that cost-benefit analysis. So I'd rather see more, it's always better to start with elected official legislation that informs and empowers regulation. To the extent we don't have that, let's see some rulemaking where there's a really public interface.
Well, thank you. Oh, another question? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so, a lot of macro comments off on the panel that I would agree with, but of course we all know the devil's in the details, right? And so, it's wonderful, I think, from a legal and a regulatory perspective, to sit back and say, hey, we need feedback, we need education, you guys have to help us figure out how to get on the right tracks. But quite frankly, on the other end, right, you're sitting on, say, the investment management, right, where the regulation, I believe, is correct. There's two different levels, right? Managing the investment management side of things should be a little bit easier than certain other technological aspects. But those guardrails aren't being put in place in any sort of capacity. I'm being disincentivized from actually, I want to do everything without suspenders capacity, right? But if you're basically going to tell me it's my responsibility to come into the room, to give you information, for me not to understand what's going to happen at the end of that, oh, by the way, I have to pay 30, 50 grand of extra legal bills every month. Yep. It's not going to help get where we want to go. So I guess my real question would be, is there a way to begin to try to broker that? Because I think there are a lot of people who really would like to provide education and provide nuance and provide guidance, but until you incentivize those people in the correct way, we're not going to do it.
I think what you propose is a bit of a chicken or the egg, right? I think from the Hill perspective, their incentive is different from the incentives that you just outlined there. Their incentive is paternal, really, if we want to be able to categorize it in a certain way. And essentially it is saying that, hey, industry, you want this to be mainstreamed and legitimized and so on and so forth. So you have to present your case as to why we should pay attention to it and devote resources. The professor mentioned crypto is very important to us, But there are a number of other things on the legislative docket, from farm bill to the debt ceiling and so on and so forth. So I understand your perspective, but I think frankly, from any industry that's looking to get some investment from the Hill or from the administration, it is incumbent on you to present the case as to why it needs attention.
Wouldn't the regulatory agencies maybe say something different even, right? My first responsibility is a fiduciary to my investors, not to the industry.
Yeah, so here's the problem. A member of Congress has a constituent come to them and say, I put my money in Celsius. Alex Mashinsky said it's so much safer than a bank, it's completely safe, and I lost my house as a result of that. Now, that has nothing to do with what you're talking about. They're different things. I completely agree. But remember, if you're a member of Congress, you're dealing, even if you're someone who's on one of the relevant committees, you're dealing with 16 other different issues that are completely unrelated. You're concerned about that. And so, is it fair, is it rational to say that, and therefore we have the actions? Maybe not, but this is sort of the nature of the way the world works. The administrative agencies, they are working within the mandate they have. And they are getting a lot of pressure from those members of Congress saying, what are you doing? My constituents got screwed by these bad actors who were driving around these Lambos. And so that's the reality. And like, it would be nice if we were in an environment where we didn't have to think about that, but that's the environment we're in.
I think we got to wrap it there because we're like way over. But anyway, thanks to this great panel. We could talk all day about it.
Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't want to cut you guys off. I didn't realize we were out of time.